Welcome to the Billionaire Lifestyle Podcast with your host, Emmett Muckles. Please visit iTunes, Stitcher, or emmettmuckles.com to listen to all the episodes for free.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Billionaire Lifestyle Podcast. This is your host, Emmett Muckles. You can find the podcast on emmettmuckles.com. That's EMMIT and then Muckles all together, MUCKLES.com. It's available on iTunes and Stitcher for your consumption. Please go to the website, leave me some comments, or go to iTunes or Stitcher, leave me some stars and some reviews so that I can keep up this great work for you. Today, my guest is Jordan Cooper. Jordan Cooper is all about public service. As a matter of fact, he left his job to become a political candidate. How are you doing today, Mr. Cooper?
I'm doing excellent today, Emmett. Thanks so much for having me on your show.
So let me ask you this, because, I thought about being in the public service arena, but a friend of mine really talked me out of it over a beer. He says, look, it takes a special kind of individual to get into the political arena. What was your motivation to be of public service in that capacity?
So it goes back to childhood, really. When I was 5 years old, my next door neighbor was the president of the Montgomery County Board of Education, and I volunteered in his campaign. And he was the first Asian American elected in the state of Maryland to elected office, and he was in charge of what is now a $2.3 billion a year school system with 150,000 kids. Obviously, it was smaller back in 1990. From there, I guess public service has always been a part of my life, especially around the time of our bar mitzvah in '98. I've been volunteering almost every month of my life since then. It's really that spirit of volunteerism that eventually led to me running for public office. So volunteering in a maximum security prison in New York to speak to inmates, volunteering in elementary schools and middle schools in Poughkeepsie and in Baltimore, going on to Cape Town, South Africa, teaching township kids how to play tennis, volunteering as a farmer in Senegal and in Turkey, and then in Baltimore City, the animal shelters and the Boy Scouts, just theater usher, just a million different things where I've always taken great pleasure in doing volunteer work. And so when I was in high school, in 2003, in Bethesda, I ended up becoming a page in the Maryland House of Delegates, befriended a few delegates, and then after college, ended up working for one for a few years in Baltimore City. And while working for him, I volunteered on a bunch of campaigns, including Democratic Governor Martin O'Malley's reelection campaign in 2010, a number of mayoral, delegate, and senator seats. I was on a dozen campaigns as a volunteer and an election judge. Began getting appointed to boards, and then in 2013, a few vacancies arose. I decided to pull the trigger. I left my job and went from just my idea of I wanted to run for the House of Delegates to building an 80-person team over the course of 18 months, working 120-hour weeks, raised $60,000, sent out 140,000 pieces of literature, raised $20,000 of that, so one-third of that total amount of money from voters at their doorstep. I knocked on 12,000 doors. I did meet 40,000 voters over the course of that campaign cycle, and 1 in 6 voters who met me at the door gave me cash on the spot, investing in the campaign's Get the Vote efforts. Really an incredible experience. I'd be happy to elaborate more upon it, but in some, it was just something I've been building up for a long time.
So it wasn't as if you were not versed in the political climate that you were about to, move into, because, on the onset, when we first began to talk, I thought that you may have been like, I'm going to run for office. But no, you were kind of versed into the public arena. So that was kind of the next step because you had already made some inroads to it. Did you find any surprises once you got into the community itself? Things that you did not understand and say, oh, I didn't expect that?
Sure, yeah. Well, there were a number of surprises. So right now, speaking to you in May 2017, I'm 32 years old. When I launched my campaign, I was 27 years old. So there's a few reasons why I lost, and some of those reasons were things often that I could do nothing about, but was completely unaware of the importance of these things when I decided to run. So one, I have a very young face. So I was 27, but I looked 17. So people presumed that I didn't have any experience, even though by the time Election Day came around, I've been in the workforce for 10 years. People also presumed I didn't have a graduate degree or an undergraduate degree sometimes because of that. And I have those degrees, but perception I learned is a lot more important than reality at times. I learned that money matters. I was outspent by more than $500,000 of the people who came ahead of me. Most of them were able to provide them their own campaigns with six-figure contributions from their own pocket. So I didn't realize the extent to which wealth really mattered, and incumbency. I ran an 18-month campaign. I knocked on every door of every super Dem, it was a closed primary in Maryland, so only Democrats could vote for me. And in my district, which is heavily partisan, the Democrats always carry the general. Mm-hmm. So really the competitive race was a primary. I hadn't realized the power of incumbency and money. And I thought, well, if I just reach all these voters and talk to them and convince them and they contribute to me, they're really going to turn out and vote for me. It turns out that only about 4 to 5% of the total electorate actually need to vote for you to get into office, and only 18%, or 1 in 6, of the registered Democrats in the most educated city in the country, Bethesda, Maryland, actually turned out to vote. Bethesda, where 3 out of 4 adults have a bachelor's degree or higher, and half of all adults have a master's degree or higher. So very well educated and not engaged in electoral politics in the primaries on local levels. And so I also was surprised. I had given so much of myself over decades to public service, to volunteerism, to Maryland politics, to the Democratic Party in Baltimore City and in Annapolis, which is the capital of Maryland. And having done all those things, it counted for naught. There's a man, Tip O'Neill, former Speaker of the United States House of Representatives under the Ronald Reagan administration in the 1980s, and Tip said all politics is local, and that's so true. I found out, much to my surprise, that none of the voters really cared very much about what I had done for the Democratic Party in Baltimore City or Annapolis. It was, what have you done in my own neighborhood? What have you done in Bethesda? What have you done in Bannockburn and Glen Echo and these tiny little neighborhoods? What have you done for us here? And it didn't really matter that I was from there. I was born and raised in a district that I ran for, but I'd done a lot of my work for the party 40 miles away in Baltimore or Annapolis, and that really didn't matter. That surprised me. I was the only candidate without a house, a spouse, or children, and that really, I think, was a bit of legitimacy that I lacked. And then, of course, I was the only one out of 8 candidates who had never been on the ballot previously. Again, not anything that you can help, but something I didn't realize would really work against my favor. So those were all things. And then, of course, one of the wonderful things I learned, which was a great surprise, was I was able to fundraise at the door to the extent that I was. I raised on average $25 an hour knocking doors. Again, that isn't for me, so I can't use that money to buy a burger on vacation. That's money for the campaign. And the overwhelming majority of the money was spent actually on postage stamps, which was another surprise. I didn't expect to spend $30,000 on postage stamps for direct mail. So, but the big surprise, I guess, was that there was so much generosity, especially from individuals who couldn't even really afford it. I remember one story. I knocked on a woman's door, and she said, "Well, gosh, you're such a bright young man. I really like the stories, and I'm a widow, and my husband, he died in the Vietnam War in '71, and I'm here in my little old house, and I don't have very much to live on, and I actually have $1 worth of quarters, pennies, nickels, and dimes, and I was going to use that to get a burger at McDonald's. Now it's going to be my lunch. I don't have very much to give you, but I really believe in you. I'd like to offer this dollar to you to help your campaign." And I think, that really touched me, because there are, even in an affluent area, you do have people who are struggling, and people are willing to invest in the campaign, to be part of something larger than themselves. Even people who have very little resources available to them are interested in becoming part of something larger than themselves. So there are many inspiring things along the campaign trail. And of course, the experiences that you have as a candidate are unparalleled as a volunteer. Having been on campaigns before, I was like, I understand campaigns. I've knocked doors, I've made phone calls, I've designed stuff. There's no explaining what a political candidate does. to anyone who hasn't been a candidate. Even if you're right there as a campaign manager or a volunteer, you really don't understand what it's like to be a candidate until you are the candidate.
So let me ask you this. So everyone talks about campaign finance reform, and we hear about candidates who get into office then spend the majority of their time trying to raise funds for the next election, or just funds to kind of keep afloat in the system. Do you think that all those things that you experience kind of reinforce that ideology that our civil servants are actually just trying their best to maintain their status in office financially versus being able to really get some things done?
So that's a really packed question. There's a few things we have to differentiate in that question. One, remember, so members of the Maryland House of Delegates and Maryland State Senate earn a salary of $43,500 a year. They're in session 90 days during that period, so 1/4 of the year. And then the other 3/4 are expected to have a job. Of course, they're delegate all year round, so they have different issues and meetings, bill hearings, community meetings, and they have constituent services they have to provide all year round. That's their salary that they can use for whatever they want. That money goes in their bank account. When you talk about political contributions, that's a contribution to their campaign, not their bank account. So the fundraising that you do isn't money that you can use for whatever you want. That money is only to be used for political expenses related to the campaign, namely postage stamps, direct mail, advertising and TV and radio, or paying staff, buying materials, paying printing costs for your yard signs, your campaign literature. In Congress, it's often common knowledge on the federal level that you have to raise, depending on your media market, a few $1 million. In fact, in my district, we just experienced the most expensive congressional race in American history, where in the Democratic primary, one candidate spent $12 million of his own money in the campaign, among a field of candidates spending a few $1 million each, elevating the total expenses up through the primary to $20 million. So it went a little to that by the general. That was for Maryland's 8th congressional district. So it does get quite expensive. But you got to remember, you get into office not with money, not with yard signs, but with votes. And you have to remember that the majority of the American people aren't voting, especially in the primaries. When you have 5 out of 6 registered Democrats deciding not to participate, if you were to convince those 2 people, 2 out of those 5 non-voting Democrats to vote for you, then you can be anything you want it to be. You can be governor, U.S. senator, whatever you want. There's so many people are disengaged, and there's so much apathy that among the individuals who do vote, money has a big influence. Now, another thing I want to talk about with money is, so if votes matter, why does money matter? Well, the thing is, if somebody gets a piece of mail in the door, if you have a paid canvasser knock on your door, a paid ad hits you on TV, then if you're willing to be convinced by that, then money matters. So I have an idea that there's a way to inoculate people against political expenditures, the influence of political expenditures. If you want to reduce the influence of money in politics, public financing the campaigns is a great thing. It's a great idea. Trying to reverse the Citizens United decision in the U.S. Supreme Court was a great idea. But what you really got to look at is the root of the problem, which is people are disengaged and are not voting, and when they do vote, it's not necessarily in an informed fashion. Now, if you ask any elected official, not in their elected capacity, but in their individual capacity as American citizens, you can cast the ballot for another race in which they're not running, they usually have personal relationships with every single candidate on the ballot. So they already know who they like, who they don't like. They have personal opinions of all of them. They know them, and they're going to vote for who they think is best. And there's no amount of political mail or TV ads that will influence those people, those elected officials' votes for the most part, because they already know these people. The problem is that in a delegate district with 120,000 people, you're only one person. I met 40,000 people over the course of a year and a half, and they weren't all the people living in my district. It's physically impossible to meet them. So the idea is, how do you make people informed to some extent, or at least to a closer extent, like the most insiders are informed? And if everybody were to feel as though they, in a sense, had a chance to get to know all the candidates, I feel like they'd be in a good position to choose which candidates they'd like to get elected. And if they could do that, then if they decide between Joe and Sally, and they say, you know what, I met Joe, I met Sally, I think Sally is the better candidate, so I'm going to vote for Sally, and in between that time, Joe spends $1 million trying to convince you to vote for him, I think you'll still vote for Sally. And so with Public Interest Podcast, and I'm the host of a podcast, I interview politicians, and I try to, among many other public servants, I try to provide listeners with an opportunity to create a facsimile of a meet and greet or a campaign door stop, and basically give you an opportunity to meet these elected officials, especially the ones who aren't being reported on by diminishing local media. And you can meet them and determine who you like best, and hopefully that will diminish the influence of money. So there's a long way of saying, yes, campaign finance reform is important, yes, fundraising is important, but more than anything, it's about reaching out to voters directly and letting them know what you're all about, and hopefully identifying with them such that they feel not only interested in supporting you, but interested in going to the polls and casting their vote for you.
And, there's one thing that I really understand from the populace and just being in America itself. A lot of times people don't understand the hierarchy of political candidates. They don't know what really affects them, because most of the change that you can make in government is made at your local level versus our national level, which we've seen, and we're kind of torn apart with the last election. How would you best give people advice to understand what and who they can vote for in their system?
So, again, let's unpack that question. Well, first thing, I'm a member of the League of Women Voters, which is a national organization that is nonpartisan. So they don't support Democrats or Republicans or Libertarians or Green Party. They just provide the information and for every party. And there's a website, vote411.org. That's vote411.org. You can go there, and they have a lot of information on your local candidates. Also, obviously, you go to Google and type in your whatever state you're in. So you're in Ohio, type in Ohio State Board of Elections or Nevada State Board of Elections, and they'll have a list of all the different candidates in terms of just trying to figure out what offices are representing you. In Maryland, if you go to mdelect.net, you can type in your home address, and then on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll have a list of every elected official who represents you on the state, county, and federal levels, I believe. So I think your question was, how do you find out who is representing you? Yeah. But I guess there's a different question.
So how do you find? So there's usually quite a few people who are on the ballot, and to really find out anything about them, most people get their information from television or. Yeah, from television, where they see these smear campaigns and things going against them from their opposite opponent. But many a times they don't even know that what's fully available on the ballot on any given election, whether it be primary or your general election. How can they be more? How can they have more information starting at the onset? Because I think that's where a lot of the apathy comes from, is people they're bombarded in television because that's the first thing that they see. And all they see is these two candidates. For instance, our last election on the national level, which was, it got down to Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, but there were a host of other candidates that were available, but they just weren't part of the conversation for people to even think about. So at the local level, where would someone start? Is it the local school to find out what precinct and who's available in that precinct?
So there's a few questions there. I think I heard so who is running for office? What offices are being elected? How do I find out which candidate is the best one for me to support, and how does that impact my life? So, first of all, when Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump ran against each other in the presidential election, I heard some people say, well, it doesn't really matter. I don't like either. I'm not going to vote. And people forget that in many places there's a 5-page ballot that voters have. So you can decide to go and vote and ignore the presidential top of the ticket if that's what you're interested in doing. And there's still sheriff and board of education and state representative and state senator. And there's a U.S. congressman, and every 2 years you have that on your ballot on the election. And then you have your U.S. senator. They have 6-year terms, which are staggered. So in every 6-year period, you'll have a 2-year, and then maybe a 4 and a 2. But you have so many different, and then you have ballot referendum. you hear about different referendums for gambling or marriage equality or dog catcher. Marriage equality isn't an issue anymore, but there was a famous Proposition 8 in California a few years ago. So there's a lot of different ballot initiatives. Should we increase the property taxes? These are all things that will be on the ballot. So when you say, I don't like those presidential candidates, I'm not going to vote, there's so much more in the ballot that really affects you. So I think the way you find out what the ballot will look like is you go to the State Board of Election website. And then after you find out who's on there, who's the best for you and why does it affect you?
I think
the first thing I'd say...
That was it.
Yeah, so the first thing I'd say is look at you. Look wherever you are. If you're in a room right now, look up. You see a ceiling? Did you see electricity? Did you drink any water today? That's all government. Did you eating a hamburger and knowing that it's beef? That's the FDA. That's the USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, and they're determining, that beef is beef. Instead of there may be instead of straw or rat or whatever, and we had those issues 100 years ago. And you had Upton Sinclair with the jungle call attention to that. Okay, the roof isn't falling down on you. There are local building codes, which means that it has to be built to a certain standard so that it doesn't collapse on you. Electricity is a certain wattage. It's regulated by government. That you have that it's not going to explode with a sudden increase of voltage, or that it's available, or that it comes from renewable sources from a certain proportion of portfolio. That you were able to get to work today because of a federal road or a county road that were paid for with tax dollars. The fact that you're able to read a sign, you were made literate, probably many individuals were made literate with the help of tax dollars in the public school system. So there's so much that every element that we were able to drink water that was potable, that was clean because of public health initiatives in the early 20th century that led to standardized water distribution and and sewer pipes and infrastructure. So there's just everything that we do in life is affected by different levels of government. And so when someone says, I don't like the government, my first question is, well, which level of government and why, right? So there's a federal government, state, local, could be municipal, could be county, and so there's different levels of government, and there's different services that government provides. So I guess that's I see why it matters is you pay taxes and you want to know how your money is spent on these services that affect every aspect of your day. And then finally, who should I vote for? You got to get to know them personally. I think ultimately you can't understand every issue that they're going to be voting on. That's why we don't have a pure democracy in the sense of every citizen votes on every measure. We have a representative democracy where elected officials spend their time in a committee becoming experts about things, learning about issues that are quite complicated while you're going about your life, and then you're investing your trust in them to vote on certain things. And so I guess I would try to find an individual who aligns with you on a few core issues that you agree with, values, and of course recognize that legislating is only one role of an elected official. They try to pass laws, but they also do a lot of constituent services. If a certain government service isn't being provided, if you're not getting Medicare or your Social Security checks, your Medicare coverage isn't coming in the way you want it, if there's a pothole in your street, if your road isn't getting plowed of snow, those are reasons why you would call an elected official, and then they try to help sort it out and make government work better for you. So politicians don't just make laws, but they also are your ombudsman to government. So I guess those are the ways that I would, one, understand who's running for office, two, understand how government affects me, and three, so I identify who would best represent me in government.
And let's diverge a little bit. Let's talk about your podcast. And your podcast, what is the basic focus of it? Is it for local, or is it for national, or is it a conglomeration of a little bit of everything politically?
Sure. So Public Interest Podcast is a series of interviews where I interview politicians, activists, advocates, and others who seek to improve the state of the world. I've done 200-plus episodes to date. It's a daily podcast. It comes out with a weekly email blast. Each week has a theme. So Maryland Politics Week, Press Week, Religion Week, Diplomacy Week, many different themes. It's actually international, national, state, and local, and nonprofit and non-governmental. It's everything. It's anyone who's seeking to advance the public interest. And why? Why is the world a better place? Because you're in it. So I have U.S. senators and congressmen, governors. I have foreign parliamentarians from other nations' legislatures. I have diplomats, so some of them are former politicians in their countries and are currently ambassadors to the United States. Those are all international and national congressmen. And I have state. I have governors. I have state delegates, state senators. And then I have local. I have mayors. I have council members. And then I have executive directors of local nonprofits, of national nonprofit organizations. I have attorneys, doctors, religious leaders. I have imams, rabbis, priests, atheists, all kinds of people. And the message I'm trying to convey is multivarious. So one is public service is admirable, honorable. There's so many people doing it, and it's for everyone. And you don't have to just want to be a politician to do it. If you're like, oh, I'd love to do public service, but I have no interest in being a congressman, great. What do you have an interest in? You want to feed the homeless? Well, there's a nonprofit executive director who's doing that, and that's a job that you could do. Another thing I wanted to convey is there's a rising tide of anti-establishment populism where they hate establishment politicians, and I think there's reason for that. The reason is the only time you read about politicians in the news is when they screw up. This one's with a prostitute. That one's embezzling public funds. This one's doing something bad. That's sensational. That's in the news. And people read, every time they read about a politician, he's screwed up. Therefore, all politicians are all screwing up all the time. But the truth of the matter is most politicians, 95%, and that's just a random number, but the majority, all the ones I know, they're not really making any mistakes. They're doing their job. They're legislating. They're doing constituent services, and that's too boring for the front page. Combine that with a diminishment of local media coverage with the fourth estate, and what you have is an arena where there's no positive coverage of public service. So I'm trying to create a more positive association, public servants. And then finally, there's a rising tide of racism, xenophobia, and just hate and distrust, and I think that's born of a lack of familiarity. So I hope that a liberal will listen to a Tea Party Republican on my show and recognize their humanity. I hope that it'll go back and forth. An anti-Semite will listen to a Jew. A homophobe will listen to a gay guest on my show. And I hope through that we breed more respect for civil discourse and diminish intolerance in society. Perfect example is someone I know who works at an embassy had an idea that the Voice of America wasn't an American propaganda arm. So I went over and interviewed the executive director of Voice of America, and I actually had her tell her story and why she thinks she's advancing the public interest. Now, my other friend who works in the embassy may still not be convinced that it isn't the propaganda. They may still say, that's still American propaganda arm, but I want her at least to know that within Voice of America, those individuals leading the organization do not perceive it that way and perceive themselves to be independent. So in the very least, I want to convey that we all seek to advance the public interest and merely differ in our understanding of what constitutes the public interest and how we ought to get there.
One thing that I wanted to bring up, and it was right in the middle of your speaking there, is I've had these conversations with people, and I've heard it over and over again when they say the House of Representatives or Congress does not accurately represent the populace that's in America. And when I say that, I'm referring to age because, I talk to a lot of young women. I talk to a lot of young men. I talk to multiple people of very ethnicities. And the one thing that they say that they're most kind of upset about, and I'm going to put it bluntly, they're just saying, like, it's just full of old white men who don't reflect our ideologies, and we don't know how to get our representation in place.
Yeah, so diversity is an interesting issue. It's come up many times in my podcast. Legislatures, so a lot of individuals would like the demographics of a legislature to reflect the demographics of the areas they're representing. And that's a fine idea. I believe it shouldn't be the only qualifier for why you vote for someone, but it's definitely something that you're welcome to take into consideration. Now, there is increasing diversity in the nation's legislatures, but you're right, and I don't have the statistics on this, but I'm also under the impression that the majority of elected offices in the United States are held probably by white men. I don't know the statistics on that, though. I do believe that there are about 500,000 Americans living today who are either in elected office or run for or have held elected office. So significant in proportion.
what do you do about that? Well, one, you can run yourself. Two, you can run somebody else. Three, somebody's running, you can help them work on their campaign. You can, but something else I'd like to I guess, articulate is when you look at Selma, Alabama in the 1960s, when you look at the allies of Martin Luther King Jr., it wasn't just African Americans, right? There were, when you look at the Mississippi burning, those three boys who were freedom riders, and they actually got shot down in the South in the 1960s. One of them was a white Jewish kid.
Yeah, I know
Chicago,
that. I was about to bring that up.
So you know, the best, you know, if for instance, I'm a pro-choice candidate, most Democrats are, and that refers to abortion rights for women. Well, I'm not a woman, so why should I care? How can I represent a woman's view? Well, you know, the fact of the matter is that we all have many identities. You know, I have an identity as a healthcare professional. I have an identity as a politician, as a public servant, as a son, as a father, as a brother, as a graduate of liberal arts school, as a person who's lived abroad, as a person who values, you know, mass transit and what different. I mean, we all have different values, priorities, and identities. As a tennis player, as this or that. And so I guess you can find people who represent your interests who don't look just like you.
You know,
because, you know,
can I interrupt here? And
please, yeah.
And my statement was not so much on race, but for me, and I think this was what was prevailing in the conversations, was basically age. And the reason why I bring up age is because, you know, at a certain thing, your father won't quite have the understanding of the time as you will. As will your grandfather won't have the understanding of either of your times. So, you know, and our society is changing so rapidly where we still have baby boomers who came out of that generation who left high school, got a job, was able to provide for their families. And now we're in a wholly different society where we are no longer in a manufacturing society. We're in basically a service economy, and I like to almost say an internet economy. So the whole landscape is changed, and I don't feel that, and it's not just me. I don't believe that the constituency or majority of this constituency believe that the representatives have a reflective mindset. That's how I want to put it. I don't believe they have a reflective mindset of the majority of the people who are, I'd say, 18 to 40. So there are a number of millennials in the U.S. Congress. There are a number of millennials in elected office and state legislatures around the nation and in other offices as well. And at the same time, you also have millennials currently having the lowest voter turnout of any age bracket in the nation, and over the course of the second half of the 20th century, which is the only, I guess, part of this of American history where I have accurate voter data records, the age bracket of voters from 18 to 30 or so has always been the lowest voter turnout demographic. Now, it was elevated, for instance, during Vietnam above the same age bracket now, but the youngest have always been the least likely to turn out to vote. And as you get more responsibilities and you have to pay a mortgage and become more grounded in the community, and you have kids in the public school, that's when you start seeing people tend to get more engaged in their community and voting and running for office. But you do have a historical trend of people in their 20s being in elected office. For instance, former Vice President Joe Biden was one of the youngest senators ever possibly elected. In fact, he was elected to the U.S. Senate at age 29 and sworn in at age 30 because he had his birthday in between Election Day and Inauguration Day, and 30 being the youngest age when you can be elected to the United States Senate. There's a long history of many politicians getting their political career and first being elected to office in their 20s and 30s. In order to get more, if you want more representation of millennials in office, then I have one word for you: vote. That's the obvious point, but how do you motivate someone to vote when they feel that it doesn't matter? Because that is and particularly, in recent elections,
so that's the easy one.
That's what people feel. that it doesn't matter?
So the answer is nobody knows, and nobody's ever been able to figure it out, period. And the reason I can say that is because we've always had low voter turnout, especially compared to other nations. You look at Australia or Venezuela, they have mandatory voting. You get fined a few $100s if you don't show up and vote. Then they have higher voter turnouts as a result, which can be argued. You can argue either way, whether that's good or bad. It probably won't ever come to pass in America. You do tend to have higher voter turnouts in other industrialized nations. It's unbelievable to me that our first modern democratic republic, we have consistently low voter turnout rates, which continues to decline in a directly inverse relationship with an expenditure of political funds. So, that there may be a cause there. In terms of how do you motivate them to vote? Well, with Public Interest Podcast, I'm trying to do something a little bit out of the box. So when you talk to the political establishment, and just to be clear and show my cards to your listeners, I currently am an area coordinator for the Montgomery County Democratic Central Committee. So I'm part of a Democratic Party apparatus in Maryland and suburban D.C. So I'm speaking partly from within the party apparatus, and I'm saying, right now, the party is basically saying what it's always said. We need to knock more doors, raise more money, send more mail, and make more phone calls. And that's it. And that's generally the same strategy, repeated ad nauseum, all the way back for at least as long as I've been alive. And I've spoken to a lot of individuals, and it was going on back through the 60s, and I'm sure earlier than that. What I'm trying to do with the podcast is I'm trying to increase exposure of these 188 members of the Maryland General Assembly to the public. Most members of the public, a lot of members of the public don't even know they have a state legislature. Most people don't know that the United States has 51 constitutions, 1 federal and 50 state constitutions.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't understand different levels of government with basic civics class, and let alone who represents them or how many people represent them. Every state is different. In Maryland, most places of Maryland have 3 delegates from 1 senator elected to a 4-year term that starts and ends on the same day, representing the exact same geographical area. That's an aberration. Virginia, for instance, has multiple delegates for 1 senator district, and the senator has a 4-year term, and the delegates have a 2-year term. It varies by state, but people don't even know how it works, let alone who occupies it. So when you say, how do you motivate them to vote? The first thing I think is you let them see how ubiquitous the impact of government is in their lives. Don't like traffic? Look at people going on to Metro instead of getting in their cars. You don't like, you want more green space? You don't like all the concrete in your urban area? Well, that's where parks come in. You want more meeting spaces and areas where you can have clubs and you can do different activities? Well, that's maybe what libraries are for. You want to have your kids compete in the new world economy against China and other world leaders? Well, that's what our public education system is for. And even if you're in the private sector, you want to have a trucking business or a shipping business, that's what our highways are for. So I think people don't recognize the extent to which government influences our lives and don't understand how their tax dollars are spent and the immense power that every individual has to exert their own influence over how that tax money, those tax revenues are spent. If you show people how empowered they are and that their voice does matter, and that, for instance, if you live in a very urban area and you know a Democrat's going to get elected, there's a big difference between a Bernie Sanders Democrat and, a conservative Blue Dog Democrat from the South. There's a big difference between
let me interrupt you for a minute here.
Sure.
So, I think one of the things that is affecting our overall is one level of comfort in America. Because, many Americans at our worst, and I've traveled to other countries, we're pretty comfortable compared to most other countries globally. 2, I believe it's part of our education system because we don't put the proper emphasis on understanding government as some other countries that perform that action during their primary schooling. So I don't think a lot of people are very educated out the box. It's really like this thing has been going on for a long time, so we're just going to kind of roll with it. And if somebody piques our interest, usually through the form of mass media, such as television and other forms that or radio, they tend to float with that. And your demographic, because you said you're 31, correct?
32.
You're 32. So you would be classified, how we like to classify people, as millennial. And do you think that how do I want to rate? How can we overall, and I know the podcast is a good thing because a lot of people gather information from podcasts, but it's only a small percentage of the population who really digest podcasts. And I'm just you're making me think, and I'm wondering, how can you raise the level of intelligence of the political process for the average American, because it's really not in the forefront of their brain until every 2 or 4 years. And the only way I can really think of it is, things like you're doing, but there has to be more. It has to be in the forefront, because everything else that we see is just propaganda from either left, right. There is really no center, because we don't even know what that is anymore. And even those factions have even gone off to their subgenres of left and right.
So there are ideas. So, for instance, a lot of movies in Hollywood are about the high school experience or the college experience, because those are common, nearly universal experiences for Americans. If you created some sort of common public service experience, right? So with the Greatest Generation, you had the draft in World War II, and then Korea, and then for the baby boomers, you had the Vietnam War as a common service experience. Some countries have a draft in effect, but instead of it just being a military draft, you could do a public service draft. So if there was a requirement, so for instance, where I went to high school, there's a requirement to do 60 hours of community service before you graduate can get your high school diploma. If there was some sort of, you could either have a requirement or you can make it voluntary to guarantee that every American between the ages of 18 and 26, I'm also in the Selective Service Draft Board in Montgomery County, Maryland. So that's the draft eligibility age. So every American between 18 and 26, say, will guarantee you 18 months of employment, getting you experience in the workforce, making our country better. You can work on the parks, you can work in a senior assisted living home, you can work anywhere in many different places. But the idea is if you created a common experience for all Americans, where you can say, look, this isn't really partisan. What we're trying to do is make life better for all Americans. And if you have this sense that I participated in this and I'm trying to make our community better for us, and if you had more ownership of our own community and of our future and the sense that we're all in it together, that may, in a sense, potentially down the road lead to more increased civic participation. And it's not only voting. It's a lot of volunteerism. It's organizing. It's creating groups. It's getting together with other people and saying, how can we make X better?
Yeah, I believe you're right, because there are various countries around the world that require public service, usually immediately after high school or after your primary education, so that you at least have a sense of community involvement or state involvement. And we don't have that to the degree that we used to, particularly with, I think that ended with the Vietnam War, and we haven't seen it since. So let me ask you something. Here, what could you give the audience tips to move forward and make them very succinct, how people can get involved with the process, or they can update their constituency, which is their peers and friends, to get involved with the process?
So I guess the first thing I'd recommend is be an informed consumer of information. So read multiple sources of news, including news from sources that espouse opinions you disagree with. Try to look at local blogs, local papers, national, international. If you really can, maybe look at a German or British or French or Argentinian publication in English. You can get all that online pretty easily these days. So one is become an informed consumer of news. Know what's going on in your world. That's number one. 2, vote. 3, give a call your elected officials. Ask them to sit down for a coffee or meet and greet. I expect fewer people to do this, but I'm 100% certain that if you call up your elected official
and you have many. Each American probably has 24 individuals in elected office representing them at different levels of government. Call up one of your elected officials and ask just to get coffee for a half hour. See if they'll do it. Get to meet your elected officials, understand what government does, and then also part of completely separate from government. I recommend that people get involved in their communities. That could mean being an usher at a theater, walking dogs in an animal shelter, being a Big Brother, Big Sister program. There's all sorts of cleaning up your park. There's all sorts of programs and clubs that are always looking for volunteers. I think it starts with something small, maybe once a month, maybe a few times a year, and then you can build from there. I think the most important thing is that you take action to make the world better for others. And once you do that, the rest is just continuing in the same trajectory.
Well, that was awesome. So, Mr. Cooper, I thank you so much for being on the Billionaire Lifestyle. Is there any last words you have for the Billionaire Lifestyle audience?
Be engaged. Care about your community, because it's your community. You're a part of it. And if you're interested in listening to other inspirational stories of other people who've worked to make the world better for others, you can listen to Public Interest Podcasts at publicinterestpodcast.com or on iTunes or a dozen other platforms. And I'd like to thank you for having me on your show.
No problem. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been the Billionaire Lifestyle. My guest has been Jordan Cooper, and he is giving you some great information about how to be involved in your own life and community. Be of service. And actually, that's part of being alive, is to be of service of others, because if you're of service of others, you will obtain the things that you need in your life to grow as well. Till next time, enjoy your life, live prosperously, do great things. Peace. All right, hold on. Hung up too fast. Hello?
You reached the cell phone of Jordan Cooper. I cannot come to the phone right now. I'll record a message as soon as possible. Thank you.
At the tone.
Hey.
Call from
Jordan Cooper with Public Interest Podcast.
Hello?
Hey.
You hung up too fast.
Hung up too fast?
You hung up
All
way
right,
too.
I thought you concluded it.
No, I did conclude it, but that didn't mean I was done talking to you.
Okay.
That was great, man. You got a lot of energy. But here's what I would say, though. You got a lot in a little bit of time. You got to slow down, because you were moving fast. And, this is an area that a lot of people are. You want to make sure that you hold the people who are marginally interested and engage them a little bit more, because you were just flying. I mean, if you have a little bit of information about the political process, you'll understand it. But you were just moving, dude.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. Different parts of the country, I move really fast regardless of what part of the country you're in. But Ohio moves slower than New York, for instance.
Yeah, that's true. And I'm near Chicago, so I'm near Chicago, and I grew up in Detroit, so I understand that. But when it comes to the interview process, slow it down some and have a conversation. Because that's what people get and I'm going from people that I know that like to listen to podcasts, and I love to listen to podcasts, but a lot of times I like to listen to the conversation versus the
content.
Yeah, the monologue, because it could get to be a monologue. But you have a great deal of information, and it was really awesome, and you were on point with what you were saying. It was just I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know how to go slow down, dial it back a little bit.
Yeah. All right. Well, it's good to know for the future.
Yeah, you're a great man. Your energy is boundless. I was like, this guy's on fire. I'd hate to get into a debate with him because I'd be like, I just give up because he's going to talk me down.
Yeah. Well. Yeah. Thank you. I mean, I'll definitely work on trying to slow it down.
Yeah, that's the only thing. It was just like, and the reason I know this is because I was a Toastmaster for years.
Yeah.
Won a lot of contests, and one of the things that is really important is not to put too much information into one dialogue.
Right.
Make a point and then stop, particularly on podcasts. And you probably have run across this where someone's talking and you got a question and they've moved on to something, so they haven't had a chance to get their question in.
Right.
Yeah. So.
All right. Well.
But thank you so much.
When do you think this? Sure, you're welcome. When do you think it'll go live?
It'll probably be about 3 weeks because I got like 4 ahead of you.
Cool. All right. Well, will you email me when it goes live?
I'm going to email you. I am going to send you the content. I am going to send you the blog post. I am going to send you a item that you can embed on your website. I'm going to lay it out for you.
Awesome. Well, I can't wait to get it.
All right. Thank you so much, my man.
I appreciate it. Bye.
Have an awesome day. Bye. Mm-hmm.